Welcome to Unchatted Waters. In this episode, we'll take a journey down to explore the deep sea. We'll learn how animals have adapted to these extreme environments in the ocean. This journey will descend from the surface, but also travel across time and space to discover the systems that fuel the ocean, and eventually our own food webs. So seal the submarine and let's dive into the unknown. Welcome to Unchatted Waters, the podcast that talks to the people behind the science. I'm Kirsty Bradley, your host, and I'm excited to take you on a journey of discovery in our new series. My two guests for this episode. Rachel Mills is an ocean chemist with a long academic career, both teaching university students and contributing to the application of research across government organisations. Her research explores the deep ocean to understand how metals enter and are cycled in seawater, and how they are dispersed across the oceans, contributing to food webs. Andy Kenny is a Benthic ecologist, meaning he studies animals living on the seafloor and their connections in the ecosystem. He studies deep-sea vulnerable marine ecosystems and works with international partners to understand how bottom trawling impacts our seabed. Welcome to the podcast, both.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, it's very good to be here. Thank you.
It's really great to be here.
It's great to have you. So, I'm going to start with you, Rachel, and ask you, what is the deep sea?
Well, the deep sea is the biggest habitable volume on this planet. It's enormous. It's over 90% of the ocean by volume, but it's incredibly difficult to see. Probably half of the Earth's surface, but it's deep, dark, far away, and most of us spend very little time thinking about it or even noticing it. Now, water's really hard to see through, and that makes exploration of the deep ocean really difficult. We've made some remarkable advances in the last decade or so, so we've now started to map out the sea floor in a lot of detail, but there's still an enormous amount we don't know about the deep ocean. So sunlight doesn't get very far into the ocean at all. It gets maybe 100 metres, 200 metres into that sort of surface sunlit zone where all the photosynthesis occurs, where all the phytoplankton are blooming, where all the life is occurring. In the majority of life is occurring. And the rest of the ocean is twilight or absolutely pitch black. And perhaps the best way to think about this is to do something that I'm incredibly privileged to have done, which is to get into a little mini submarine and take that journey down from the surface to the bottom of the ocean. And you're enclosed in a little titanium sphere. You're launched onto the surface of the ocean in the bright sunlight, and you're bobbing about, and the ocean is clear blue, and you start to descend. Within a couple of minutes, really, it is getting pretty dark. So that sunlit zone is only 100 metres, maybe 200 metres deep, if the water is really, really clear. And it very soon becomes deep blue, and the light disappears as we go down into what we call the twilight zone. Now, the twilight zone is the really exciting bit where all the sort of exciting things happen, and we'll probably talk about that later with Andy. But by 1,000 metres or so, it's dark, and we're into the deep ocean. And it's dark, and it's cold, and the pressures are really high. The pressures at 1,000 metres, the pressure is 100 times what it was at the surface. So enormous pressures. Cold temperatures. The deep ocean is pretty constant, maybe 2 or 3 degrees centigrade. Little submarine, they don't bother with any insulation, so it's cold. You're sitting there for a couple of hours as you drift down to the seafloor that may be at 3,000 metres, 4,000 metres. But there's a lot out there. If we look out of our little portholes, we can see, as our eyes become accustomed to that dark, we can see those flashes of bioluminescence down there in the deep ocean. So there is life everywhere, but it changes dramatically as we get down into the deep. And it's much sparser. We see much less as we go deeper and deeper and deeper. But these little flashes of bioluminescence are extraordinary, like little fireworks going off as we go down into the deep.
So when you're describing going down in the underwater submarine, are you experiencing the kind of conditions that they're experiencing with that cold temperature? With the pressure, you've got a nice orb around you to protect you from that pressure because you're not adapted to that. Do you feel what it might be like for some of the animals living down there during that journey with that kind of cold temperature, and how does that make you feel?
I mean, you feel very immersed within it. It is an extraordinary experience to be inserted into the deep ocean. And so you're definitely cold. You get very, very cold because, as I said, the metal titanium sphere is a pretty good conductor of heat. And so you sit there and shiver, wrapped up in blankets. It's pitch black because we want to preserve our battery power. So we don't use battery power for things like lights inside the submarine. We use it for all the other video material, the lights outside the submarine. So it's dark, it's cold, but of course we're protected from that pressure. We stay at surface pressure as we go down, and we're protected from all that. But you certainly get a feeling for what it must be like to be inserted into the deep ocean, probably as close as we come to that sort of being a deep sea organism.
That was really interesting. I can really get an idea of what it's like living in the deep sea, and it's a great experience that you've shared with us there. So Andy, Rachel has begun to start describing some of the animals that she's seen on that kind of journey of discovery that she experienced. Yeah. So what is it like for animals living in that dark, high-pressure environment?
Well, it is a challenge. It's a challenge at three sort of fundamental levels. One is, that lack of light, I think, is a principal driver in some of the adaptations we see, particularly in the deep-sea fish populations. They have to find food. How do they do it? They have to avoid predation. How do they do that? Perhaps the most important for their survivability in the long term is how do they find a mate and produce offspring? They have evolved mechanisms. We think about the populations of fish. What we notice when we go fishing from the shallow areas into the deep sea, that we see a large shift in the types of fish that we're catching at around about 400 metres. So that seems to represent a transition from what is essentially a photic, a light-dominated ecosystem to one which is really dark. The sort of adaptations we're seeing in the fish that we catch at those depths and deeper, as Rachel's already mentioned, bioluminescence.
Sorry, jargon alarm. What's bioluminescence, please?
So bioluminescence is light which organisms create themselves through chemical reactions in their bodies. So they're actually generating light chemically. That's one way in which they can overcome the lack of natural light, is to generate their own light. And
so do they use that to attract mates or attract prey? I'm thining about the anglerfish. And
yes,
it's
absolutely.
Little lure that might have bioluminescence in the end.
Both. Yeah, they use bioluminescence to attract prey. You mentioned the anglerfish. They're bioluminescent lures. There are fish which use bioluminescence to avoid getting predated themselves as a distraction.
Okay. A bit like how squid use their ink to distract when they're trying to escape.
Yeah, very similar. And also they use bioluminescence to communicate with each other. And that's an important mechanism for finding a mate. The sense of smell as well is very heightened in deep sea fish.
So it's like a chemical.
Yeah, so they're really tasting the water around them and the chemistry of that water. Finding food is not easy. Fish will also scavenge carcasses of animals that drift down from the pelagic into the deep sea.
Now the jargon around, what's pelagic, please?
So this is the water column. There are different zones in the water column, and demersal is what you have when you get down to the seabed.
What about benthic then? Because you're a benthic ecologist, so...
Benthos is the seabed.
So one thing I thought about when Rachel was describing the temperatures that they're experiencing, how do they deal with that?
Yeah, so it's a good point. The temperature across most of the deep ocean is relatively stable at something like between 0 and 1, 2 or 3 degrees Celsius. But in the polar regions, it can get sub-zero temperatures. And there are species of fish, again, that have adapted to those conditions by having antifreeze compounds in their bloodstream that prevents ice crystals from developing. So they can tolerate sub-zero temperatures.
Wow.
And the pressure, again, so they have also specialised proteins and cell membranes that can deal with these quite extreme pressures.
I feel like I've gone on a journey of discovery in both directions, from the surface down and then through all these different species that we've talked about, which is really amazing adaptations that they have. So I guess my next question comes back to you, Rachel, about your journey. When we get down to those depths, is life across the whole expanse, or is it in smaller kind of pockets?
Well, one of the questions we've been asking as oceanographers, since oceanography was first formed as a discipline, is there life down there? And absolutely, it's everywhere. But it is very patchy. So we know that there are patches of amazing oases of clusters of extraordinary species around volcanic edifices on the seafloor. And we know there are other patches of animals around cold seeps on our continental margins. And then there are vast swathes of the deep ocean that have tiny, tiny organisms that are microscopic sometimes, or certainly very small, living in the sediment, living on the seafloor, that actually are really important, but they're not very spectacular to look at. So it's very, very varied in terms of what are the local conditions. But as you get deeper, the numbers get lower, and the biodiversity, and by that I mean the variability of the different species that are there, again, gets smaller.
Can I jargon alarm you?
I was trying really hard to have no jargon there.
I know, sorry. There's jargon alarm gone off while you were speaking there with volcanic edifices and cold seeps. So I wondered if you could describe them in a little bit more detail about what they actually look like. Because I can imagine a volcano, but I'm not sure what a cold seep is, and it'd be great to hear a little bit more about what that would look like and describe that for our listeners.
So one of the reason why we want to get down there on the seafloor is we can't sample the sort of detail from the surface by dangling some sort of claw from a ship on a 4-kilometre, 5-kilometre wire. So we need to get down there to sample these things, and that's because they're very intricate. So let's start with my volcanic edifices. So there's a huge volcanic mountain chain that circles this planet. That we call this the mid-ocean ridge. It's the biggest mountain chain on the planet. It's formed by volcanic activity. It's formed over millions of years, and it's actively forming now. So there's much more volcanoes on the deep sea floor than there are anywhere on land, going off all the time. Extremely hot rock, 1,200, 1,300 degrees Celsius, erupting into freezing cold seawater at 2-3 degrees. So you have this extraordinary melting pot of chemical reactions, and I'm a chemist and that's why I'm interested in them, which then sustain all sorts of incredible chemical reactions, and the chemical reactions themselves sustain weird bacteria. Those bacteria are the base of a food chain, and so you get these ecosystems surrounding this activity, minerals precipitating, forming metal sulfide chimneys, and those metal sulfide chimneys have hot fluid pouring out of them that is incredibly acidic, that is very, very hot. And again, these hydrothermal vents, we call them, because they're hot water pouring out of the seafloor, sustain all sorts of things that we just see nowhere else on the planet. But we also get cold seeps, so we also get chemical reactions occurring at those cold temperatures of 2 degrees, 3 degrees. Those chemical reactions, of course, will be happening more slowly, but they're just as important. Again, we've got different chemical species reacting together, which again can support these food webs. And so one of the things I'm interested in is how that chemistry supports the life on the seafloor, and then how does that disperse across the ocean.
So I wanted to go back to you, Andy, in terms of your vulnerable, that's hard to say, vulnerable marine ecosystems.
And I'm thinking now primarily about the animals that live on the seabed.
So we've gone to the benthos.
So I'm in the benthos now.
Okay. Ready, chest high,
absolutely.
in there.
Up to my neck in benthos. And again, one of the defining characteristics of a VME is you have these aggregations of sponges, and structurally they're complex. These are a large organism. A typical sponge ground would be possibly composed of sponges up to 0.5 metre in diameter, like a sponge that you'd use in your bath, but shaped as a dome. And when they're at that sort of structural complexity, the dominance, they're influencing the type of habitat. So there's an interaction between the animal and the physical environment. And that, in turn, gives rise to symbiotic relations. So there are other animals that depend on the structure actually provided by the sponges. The sponges have very unique and complex chemical compounds associated with them, and there is bioprospecting on sponges to identify cancer-busting drugs and antimicrobial drugs. In fact, something like a quarter of all compounds that have some pharmacological properties derived from the marine environment come from sponges. So they're important not just as a resource for other animals, but also they have properties which we're finding we can make use of.
So bioprospecting is going and discovering what we could be using other applications for things in the natural world.
Yes.
And pharmacological is drug-based.
Yes.
Things
So
that might be useful in medicine.
therapies for medical use.
What kind of challenges do the deep sea face in terms of if it's a source of those kind of nutrients and metals and building blocks? Does the deep sea face any challenges related to that?
The deep sea, just like all other parts of our planet, has challenges associated with humans wanting to extract stuff from that area. So more and more we're extracting novel bioactive compounds that might cure cancers or be part of our washing powders. The concept of mining the deep ocean for metals has been around as long as oceanography's been around. So on those expeditions in the 19th century, explorers pulled up what are called manganese nodules from the deep, so small potato-sized rocks that sit around on the seafloor that are essentially made up of manganese and iron oxides. We now know they form over millions of years incredibly slowly in areas of the deep ocean where nothing much else is happening. And they're strewn across the seafloor, particularly in the deep Pacific Ocean, where there's a significant amount of the Pacific Ocean is 4 or 5 kilometers deep. But since the 19th century, people have recognized that these are essentially host to a whole range of those metals that we know are essential not only for life, but for our way of living. Now, of course, things have changed hugely since the 19th century, and we've all got our mobile phones, we've all got a commitment to transition to a green economy. All of these technologies require significant amounts of batteries, which need cobalt, which need nickel, which need manganese itself. And then there's also a whole bunch of trace metals. These things are called the rare earth elements, are also present in these nodules in significant amounts. And so there's been more and more interest since the 1960s, since the 1970s, when they've been mapped out on the seafloor in extracting these nodules from the deep sea, bringing them back either onto land or processing them at sea and extracting those metals, which we know are essential for our transition to the green economy. So issues like deep sea mining, of course, are contentious. Some parts of industry are incredibly encouraged by this as an opportunity to extract metals in a new way and produce a pipeline of metals into the economy. But the jury is absolutely still out in terms of the environmental impact of extracting these things at scale. We're still exploring their distribution and their function in the food webs. What is the purpose do these hard substrates on the seafloor have? I'm absolutely convinced that this issue is not going to go away in our lifetime. We'll be talking about how and when and where we should conduct such mining. And it's really important that we understand the processes in the deep sea to be able to manage that process. We extract food from the deep sea, so we have deep sea fisheries.
There's trawling using otter trawls, so these are big nets that are towed across the seabed. They have chains and lines, so they do touch the seabed, and there's bobbins and different bits of gear. But that process of dragging a gear across the bed is very impactful. Given that these habitats, the sponges and the corals, they take many decades to grow. They reach maturity at a late age in many cases. so their reproductive capacity is relatively low. So they are sensitive, particularly sensitive to physical disturbance. And trawling is one of the main factors causing physical disturbance on the seabed in the deep sea. There are certain areas of the deep sea where only long-line fishing is allowed. In the Antarctic, the regulations there only permit long-line fisheries. And so these are static gears. They're, as the name implies, a long line, but with hooks, and the hooks are baited. And they sit off the seabed, and accordingly, they're not having a great deal of physical contact with the seabed. So we generally accept that the impacts and the risks of impacts on vulnerable marine ecosystems from long-line fisheries, deep-sea long-line fisheries, is less than from trawl fisheries.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the deep sea, and we're at the surface. The deep sea is quite far away for many of us. Not many of us have the opportunity to go into a submarine or be interacting with the industry in this way. So why should we really care about the deep sea? It's out of sight, out of mind. So why is it important for us as a society?
So I get asked this question quite a lot, actually, and I think my answer is that the deep sea stores a lot of what we pump out into the planet. So let's think about all that carbon dioxide we've burnt since the Industrial Revolution. About a quarter of that has ended up in the ocean. It's dissolved in the ocean, the plankton have taken it up. So that is a quarter of all of our emissions that would otherwise be in the atmosphere are in the ocean. And hopefully they're going to stay there. So that's one reason why we should care. We've also warmed the planet up significantly, and about 2/3 of that heat is in the ocean. Again, water is a fantastic, essentially absorber of heat, and it's a very effective way of taking up heat. Again, we want that heat to stay in the ocean, and that's why we monitor the temperature of the ocean and the chemistry of the ocean so carefully, so we can understand how it's storing the way we are changing the planet. We've also, obviously, we find our impact, we find plastic of all sizes everywhere in the ocean, and that will be there for a very long time because it's very persistent in the environment. It doesn't break down. And so again, we need to monitor the impact of our pollution in the ocean. And we need to look after it because it's there to moderate, to soften the impact of what we're doing. And if we meddle with it, at our peril. So I think we need to understand more about how it's connected to our everyday life, and that's what we do as deep sea scientists, so we can predict what will happen in the future, and we absolutely need it to retain that heat and carbon dioxide that we have put in there over the last centuries.
I guess also it's feeding our food webs as well.
There's all sorts of processes that go on here that are really important for that nutrient cycling. So if you think about, in the sunlit zone, the photosynthesis that the plankton are undergoing produces blooms of plankton, which then will, if they're not eaten by something else, will die and sink down into the deep ocean, and it'll form little clumps of aggregates or particles that are stuck together, and we call that marine snow, and that marine snow drifts down into the deep ocean. And you can actually see this from my submarine. I've seen clumps of particles stuck together that shine in the submarine lights, and that snow falls down into the deep ocean, taking that carbon and those nutrients down into the deep. As it goes, the bacteria that are living in those clusters will break down and turn it back into essentially the elements that get dissolved in seawater. So we have this extraordinary cycling of organic matter from particles in the surface ocean, recycling the nutrients back into the deep ocean. Once they get into the deep ocean, which, as I said, is cold, dark, and relatively stable and constant, then those nutrients are dispersed by the deep ocean currents, which take thousands of, or maybe 1,000 years to circulate around the deep ocean.
I can't believe it's 1,000 years. I remember that it cycled round, but I can't believe it's 1,000 years to do one cycle. It's extraordinary. That's blown my mind, actually.
1,000 years for that deep ocean current to go from, say, the Atlantic Ocean through the deep Indian Ocean into the Pacific Ocean. What goes down has to come up somewhere. So those those currents going through our deep oceans will eventually upwell, come back up to the surface in this great big conveyor belt. And that conveyor belt model is a very good way of thinking about it. Just like in your supermarket, the conveyor belt goes round and round, and what goes down must come up. And so those nutrients come back to the surface and fertilize the surface plankton again. One huge cycle that might take 1,000 or 2,000 years to complete. One of the things we're discovering as we look at the ocean in more detail, that of course it's more complicated than that. And while on average that cycle might be 1,000 years, locally there's lots of shortcuts. Locally there's lots of extraordinary connectivity between the deep ocean and the surface ocean that continuously surprises us. So of course it's more complicated than that. And of course there are channels where material gets up and down much quicker in certain areas. And that explains sometimes why the models don't work, because if the models are making assumptions that don't describe that local activity, the models will overpredict or underpredict. But also if we're trying to understand why the deep ocean is so clustered and so variable, if we have a really simplistic model to describe things, that's not going to help us when we go searching for that variability.
So if you eat seaweed or fish or anything from the ocean, then the deep sea really matters to you.
That supply of nutrients that we started this discussion about is essential for those food webs. And that supply, we need to understand it. We need to understand where the nutrients and the metals are being supplied to the surface. And so we can understand how fisheries operate, how stable the food webs are as climate changes and the ecosystems on the surface move to different latitudes. We need to understand the interaction between the food webs and those, what we call the chemical cycles in the ocean.
Yeah, I think it's just reflecting again that 90% of the ocean is deep sea. So everything that we derive from our shallower shelf sea areas is connected directly to the deep sea environment, and the processes that are occurring in the deep sea clearly have some regulatory function to play when we're looking at the resources on the continental shelves. We discover new processes, new chemistry from the deep sea. The symbiotic relationships between organisms is particularly profound in the deep sea, and that provides us with new insights into life and the evolution of life and how life can emerge from these type of environments, the chemosynthetic, the non-photosynthetic production of carbon is particularly important source of energy in the deep sea. And that is no doubt also something which occurs on other worlds, a unique insight into how life originated.
It's a really nice way to finish, actually, thinking about the symbiotic relationship of us and the ocean. If we look after the ocean, it will look after us. And I think that's a really nice place to end. So it's time for the final part of the episode, which is our feature. It's called Fun Facts, or it's been called Fun Facts in the past. And this series, we're calling it A Little Treasure. So a nugget of information or a treasure that the listener can take away from this journey of discovery, share it with others, and share the topic and this interesting and, as you say, quite profound and deep topic as well. So I'd like to come to you, Rachel, for your piece of treasure from your journey of discovery, please. So
mine is, I'm going to start from being a chemist. And so I think my treasure is that we need to think about chemistry on the tiniest scale. So down even at the sort of scale of the molecules operating in the tiny particles, on the surfaces, in the membranes of the organisms. And we need to understand how the chemistry operates at those micron levels. But simultaneously, and we can do this because we're clever people, simultaneously we need to think about how the chemistry operates over thousands of kilometres over the whole ocean basin, how that dispersal of material happens via that enormous conveyor belt we were talking about. So we need to be able to think about things over orders and orders and orders of magnitude difference in space, And then we also need to think about things happening over very different timescales. So whether it's a timescale of the cycling of the bacteria, which might be hours to days, through to thousands of years. And again, we need to simultaneously think about how the ocean operates on very short timescales through to the timescales of centuries to thousands of years.
Wow, so you're not just going from the shallow to the deep, across time as well. How far back can you go?
Absolutely. So if you collect mud from the seafloor that has been collecting over the tens of thousands of years, or maybe even millions of years, we can go back through time and we can reconstruct what the oceans were like in the last ice age, over the last 100,000 years, over the last million years. And so we can take the ocean sea floor and understand the past, certainly back to the formation of those ocean basins, which might be 100 million years or so.
And if we understand the past, we can help protect the future. That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Andy, onto your piece of treasure.
Yeah, well, as we've already mentioned, the deep sea is a low energy, certainly in terms of food, carbon, environment, that the organisms we find there tend to be slow growing and long lived. And actually, amongst all the animals on Earth, the longest lived animals are associated with the deep sea. So we have examples across a number of different animals. There's the Greenland shark, for example, has been estimated to be more than 400 years old. There are examples of black corals, which are more than 4,000 years old. Wow. And the oldest of them all are species of glass sponges, which have been estimated to be about 15,000 years old. Wow. Unique, certainly in terms of or the potential longevity of animal life.
And we need to work to make sure that continues past our small timescale.
Indeed.
Comparison.
Indeed.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for this talk. It's been a real deep dive into the topic, as I keep saying, and it was really so eye-opening, and I've definitely learned a lot more about the deep sea and how it matters to us. So I really want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was made by CEFAS, the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science. To keep up to date with us, follow us on social media using @CEFASGovUK. We hope you can join us again next time.